All right, you might get some Jingle Bell Rock going on. It's just my pen so I can point. So, the United States has witnessed profound changes in sexual attitudes and practices. In the 1920s, millions of men and women migrated from farms to cities. Living apart from their families and meeting new people in the workplace, young people enjoyed considerable sexual freedom. One reason that decade became known as the Roaring Twenties. In the 1940s and 50s, a researcher, Alfred Kinsey, published the first study of sexuality in the United States, which raised eyebrows everywhere because it was published during a time when Americans were uneasy talking openly about sex. Kinsey's study encouraged a new openness towards sexuality. In the late 1960s, the revolution truly came of age. Youth culture dominated public life, and expressions like sex, drugs, and rock and roll summed up a new, freer attitude towards sex. Now, one reason that you probably don't see a lot of transition here is you see this, and it says it's the 14th edition of Sociology written by this man or edited by this man. And what that means is this is a textbook. So here, I'll angle it down just a little bit so you can see it because we know what we're going to do here. This is a textbook quote. In textbooks, we tend to not say first and then and sometimes unless it's relevant to the timeline or the research that we are discussing. In this case, you've got time noted by decades, 20s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And if you listen carefully when I was reading, I said 1940s and 50s. Because I knew when this occurred, I can see it for one, and two, it is natural to chop that first 19 off. Don't do that when you're writing. Make sure when you're writing you say 1940s or 2010s or 1800s. You want to put the exact year. So here we go. This is where, well, that wasn't polite now, was it? Right here, in. Okay, that's where your first transition is going to go. So first, comma, lowercase I, first, comma, in the 1920s, all right? In fact, living apart, in fact, comma, living apart. Then, comma, in the 1940s, then, comma, the 1940s, all right? Consequently, comma, Kinsey's study. Consequently, comma, Kinsey's study. Finally, comma, in the late 1960s. Okay? So that's where your transitions should line up in this particular paragraph. Now, what word you chose, completely up to you. But where I place those transitions, here, 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 and here are where the words need to be. What words you chose are irrelevant as long as they make sense. Got that? As long as they make sense. Okay? Here it is. First, then, consequently, finally. I did leave out, again, I did leave out, in fact. Even when you are proofing, even when you're going back. Remember I said you need to have somebody read it backwards to you for it to make sense sometimes to see where you've left your mistake? That catches that type of mistake where you leave out something that is important. So when you're doing your test and you're looking at transitions and I'm asking you to put words in, make sure you have read it forward and you have read it backward. Can't give your test to somebody and ask them to read it. All right, making links in essays. We want to repeat words or phrases from the thesis statement in the topic sentence of each paragraph. Again, look. It made me stumble, right? I'm doing it on purpose, showing you why it is important to proofread, why it is important to make a sentence flow and to be comprehensive and cohesive. Right? So repeat words or phrases from the thesis statement in the topic sentence of each body paragraph. What that means is, if you have certain words that are keywords in your thesis, giftedness, achieving, high stimulus, intelligence testing, these kinds of words you're going to want to repeat over and over and over again. If you look back at Kinsey's paragraph here, it's all talks about sexual freedom, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, talking openly about sex, encourage new openness about sexuality. That was his thesis. That was his statement. He's talking about sexual attitudes and practices. So therefore he repeated those words over and over again so that there would be no mistake in what he was referring to. Refer to the main idea in the previous paragraph and link it to your current topic sentence. In your book they talk about insomnia. Well, it starts out as a very general discussion on sleep disorders. So they say insomnia, sleep disorder, the opposite of insomnia, which is narcolepsy, makes you suffer in your quality of life, continues with linking it back, repeating words and phrases, and making sure that your reader understands what your main idea and goal is in your paragraph. Okay? Use a transitional word or phrase to lead the reader to your next idea. Well, that's pretty simple. Well, most sufferers of insomnia tend to be sent for a sleep study. Consequently, things like sleep apnea or a brain disorder or continued stress in their life or the need for exercise, fear reactions, all of these things can lead to a sleep disorder. So I want to use things like moreover, in addition to, understanding medication, things that are going to link my idea to the next idea. Okay? Now we're going to look at revising for style. Okay, here we go. These are 3 things we have not gone in depth on. I'm going to tell you where to find them so that you can understand them if you choose to look them up. The questions themselves, these 3 questions, could be on your test as a fill in the blank, but I don't expect you to know exactly what they mean just yet. So if we're going to talk about sentence patterns, we're going to look in chapter 22 of our textbook. Parallel structure, we're going to look in chapter 25. And exact language, we're going to look in chapter 23. Sentence patterns, let's go with that first. Okay? What is a variety of sentence patterns? Well, remember when we talked about a newspaper, the first part of class, like our first day? I said, most newspapers are written on a certain grade level, like 8th grade level. Well, that's because all their sentences are short, exact, and to the point. They are the exact same length, well, not exact same length, but they're fairly close in length. They express one idea and they're very simple. All right, they have a subject, a verb, and very little else in way of sentence structure. So, for example, taking it directly out of your book, if you want to look, chapter 22, page 325. So here's no sentence variety. Got that? None. It was 1789. France was in crisis. Grain prices rose. Sounds like I'm talking in headlines, right? I'm just giving you little blurbs. Bread became more expensive. Many French citizens were hungry. They began to complain publicly. They were frustrated. They protested in the streets. Sounds like a newsreel. All right? Well, we don't want that. If you're writing an essay on the French Revolution, which is what this is about, we want it to flow just a little bit better, because you're not giving me a news story. You are giving me information. I don't want it to be too terribly long in my sentence structure, but I don't want it to be too short so that it's a boring read. So here it is with sentence variety. In 1789, France was in crisis. As grain prices rose, bread became more expensive. Feeling hungry, many French citizens began to complain publicly. Frustrated, they protested in the streets. You compacted the facts by using longer sentences in a variety of ways with some shorter sentences, but it made it more interesting. And it didn't sensationalize it. Think of it that way. You're not sensationalizing what you're actually writing. Okay? Lots of choppy sentences makes it extremely difficult to understand. It will lack cohesion and it will lack readability. All right, parallel structure. This is the stuff we learned way back in grammar school when we had to make our subject and our verb agree. So I'm not going to say things like the Americans, the British, and the people who come from Europe are very different. That's poor. That is wrong. It's faulty. It's not good. It's not the one I want you to look at. What you need to focus on would be to say something like the Americans, the British, and the Europeans. Okay, I realize the British and the Europeans are the same people, but we are making some distinctions as far as words. We don't want you to not have the words available to you that you need, but we don't want you to be overly wordy. If you get overly wordy, then nobody wants to read or listen. So to verify your sentence structure, you're going to go to chapter 25, and you can look on pages 354 and 355 to see some faulty parallel sentences. Okay? The last thing we're going to look at is exact language. This goes back to being wordy. This is chapter 23. Sorry. Page 447. You don't want to be redundant. You want to avoid cliches. And you certainly want to use standard English. Okay? So we don't want colloquial or slang or family words in our essays. If I'm telling you that I'm going to go to a store called Cochran, Blair, and Poots's, you have no idea, first off, what that store is. And you might be wondering why I'm saying Poots's. Well, that's a family thing. It's the name of the store is actually Cochran, Blair, and Potts. And it was actually a very fancy little store in my hometown of Belton, Texas. If I said I'm going to Monkey Ward's, you probably don't have a clue where I'm going. Well, I'm talking about Montgomery Ward's. What if I said I'm going to Sears? Well, I'm going to Sears. But if I'm using that kind of language and you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm not using exact language. So this is more say what you mean what you say, and be concise. Chapter 33, page 447, gives you a wordy phrase and some substitutions. Okay? A redundant phrase is a true fact. Well, if it's a fact, it's true. We know it. That's why it's called a fact. That means it's true. We tend to say in the South, the matter of the fact is, or the fact of the matter is. Well, In fact is actually more exact and more precise. Mark Twain had a very wonderful saying. He said, if you're going to use the word very, substitute the word damn, D-A-M-N. When your editor sends it back, it will be perfect. And the reason he says this is we always say they were very tired. They were very busy. It was very cold. You can only use very so many times in an essay. You can only use it so many times in a story. But in an essay, it gets particularly redundant and wordy and overbearing. So you want to use a different phrase. He was exhausted. The biting cold sent us running for shelter. Now that's wordy, but it's exact at the same time, because we're not just saying it's very cold. What's very cold to me may not be very cold to you. Past history. Well, you want to use past or history, because if it's in the past, it's obviously history. Let's see. Equally as good as. Oh my goodness, that is so southern. Equally as good as. Just as good as. You just want to say as good as. All right? So these are the things that we're looking at when we're revising for style. And the last portion of chapter 5 is talking about editing for errors, which, as I told you prior, you want to look at the lovely things that I showed you, such as here, where I purposely left out the M. Okay? Here, where I left out in fact. Where else did I go? I know there was another spot. But understand these concepts when you're writing. These are the things I, as your instructor, am going to be looking for when I'm looking at your final draft. So make sure that you have revised for coherence, for style, for continuity, for unity. Review this particular video as needed when you're writing. Obviously it's going to be up for as long as YouTube will let it be. If you want to look at circular reasoning in chapter 5, that's on page 60, and that goes along with practice 3, where you need to write in your book about weak support and giving better support, what's okay, what's not okay. You need to follow the directions. And again, I know your answers will vary on chapter 5, practice 3. So you can look at the revised paragraph as well for an example of circular reasoning. Usually when you're using circular reasoning, you don't know what you're talking about, so you just kind of reiterate the same thing in hopes that nobody notices. But trust me, when you're writing and somebody's looking at it, it is certainly very, very different. And I hope you guys have been thinking about your narration, where you have the lady with the umbrella and the spilled coffee and the guy with his pockets out. We're going to do some more brainstorming. We're going to talk about description coming up. And those are two really fairly short chapters, but it is certainly something we are going to discuss as far as how we're going to narrate and teach our K through 12 students how to take medication and do some drug education for them. So I'll see you guys in class.